So I really want to just kick this off with a few comments to introduce our moderator, Susan Dentzer. As you can see from the information, she is president and CEO of the Network for Elegance and Excellence in Health Innovation, based here in Boston. But before she came to NEHI, Dentzer was the editor-in-chief of Health Affairs, one of the leading journals of health policy, as well as working as an advisor to Robert Wood Johnson. And you may also know her as an on-air correspondent and speaker on PBS NewsHour for many years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Susan and the panel.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dick. And actually, I think Network for Elegance in Health Innovation would be a wonderful name too, as well as excellence. So thank you. It's great to be here with all of you here in Boston and in Massachusetts. And today we are going to start off, obviously, talking about what is going on in Massachusetts in various respects, but it's very important for the panel to offer this by way of allowing for discussion about whether what is going on in Massachusetts is generalizable to the other states of the Union. I live in Washington, D.C. We have an office up here in Boston, so starting a little bit over a year ago, I was coming up to Boston very frequently after having been away for some time. I had a fellowship here at Harvard years ago, but it's been a while since I'd been spending much time in Massachusetts. And when you come back to Massachusetts today, I draw the analogy, it's a little bit with respect to healthcare, like walking into a big Cineplex where multiple blockbuster movies are playing. They're blockbusters, most of them. There's some indies, independent movies. It's all quite interesting. For example, one blockbuster movie playing in the healthcare sector in Massachusetts currently is what's going on in life sciences, as we'll be discussing today. Massachusetts has more than 600 life sciences companies now and research organizations employing more than 60,000 people in the Commonwealth and a combined payroll that exceeds $7 billion a year. In recent years, Massachusetts has drawn more than 20% of all the venture capital going into biotechs nationally. And a great deal of momentum came from an initiative of the prior administration, the Deval-Patrick administration, which invested $1 billion in the life sciences sector beginning in 2008. And as we'll hear today, out of all of this is coming an amazing product stream of therapies that have the power to save lives and transform lives. So that's one blockbuster movie that's playing in the state. Another blockbuster movie in this healthcare cineplex in Massachusetts is more of an indie movie. It's what's going on in the digital health sector. And as with life sciences, a decade ago, the state is making major investments to stimulate the formation of digital health industry in the state, bringing together health information technology, other advances in computer science, machine learning, everything you can think of that goes under the rubric now, information and health sciences, to bear on building this, what it is hoped will be a very vibrant new digital health sector. And along with that, the state has created a digital healthcare council, which is a public-private partnership that will advise the administration of the current Governor Baker on the evolution of this industry. So that's another indie movie, but possibly someday to be a blockbuster movie you see playing out here in the state. Another true blockbuster movie is what's happened with respect to health insurance coverage in the state. And as you will know, as a consequence of the state's health reform law enacted in 2006, as well as the Affordable Care Act, there are now fewer than 2.8% of Massachusetts citizens without health insurance. So Massachusetts is far and away the state with the highest level of health insurance coverage. Versus the national uninsurance rate, according to census, as you know, still of 9.4% and apparently now climbing. So again, just a real blockbuster success story of coverage within the state. Then there are other blockbuster movies. One of them has to do with high health care costs. Massachusetts has the second highest level of health spending in the nation, second only to Alaska. The state expenditures, or I should say expenditures total within the state in 2016 were 31% above the national average on a per person basis, the per capita cost being about $10,500. And these costs disproportionately fall on low and middle income families. In fact, the state's Health Policy Commission has calculated that total spending on health care, including contributions made by employers to their employees' and dependents' health insurance coverage, can be as high as 30% of income for a family that's living at 3 times the federal poverty level. For a family of 3, that's $61,000 this year. So if 30% of overall family income is in effect going to health care, you have a situation which obviously for many elements of the population is untenable. The health costs within the state have been growing more slowly in the recent years than they had in the prior decade, but they're still exceeding the state's benchmark for spending. And the contributors to growth are across the board, including prescription drug spending across all the sectors. That accounts for roughly about a third of the per capita spending growth. But also hospital costs continue to go up, post-acute care, et cetera, et cetera. Now, what is striking about all of these blockbuster movies is that they all seem to be proceeding along their separate plot lines without a whole lot of interconnection among the two. There's no cross-cutting movie that explains how healthcare spending can be moderated in a state that has a blockbuster life sciences sector producing dramatically effective, in many instances, therapies at dramatic prices. There is no cross-cutting movie that ties together health insurance coverage being close to 100%, financing a lot of health care, and yet somehow making it affordable for families at the lower end of the income spectrum. Maybe there is a cross-cutting movie to be found if we take some of the topics that we're going to discuss today. For example, discussions among payers and life sciences companies about how to do value-based contracting around some of these very important new therapies. Maybe that will prove to be the movie that connects the dots. We will see. At any rate, our panel today is going to dive into all of this, particularly the biotechnology piece, focus on what will happen with 1,600 new medicines in the pipeline. And besides that area of innovation, these efforts to negotiate new value-based contracts, outcome-based contracts, risk-based contracts, to see whether we can bring all of this new activity in healthcare into the value equation that much of the rest of U.S. healthcare is slowly coming into. So let us go to our panelists now. I'll introduce them all briefly. You have their fuller bios in your packet there. We're going to hear first from Bob Coughlin, who's president and CEO of MassBio, where his mission is to advance the state's leadership in the life sciences sector and add value to the healthcare system and, of course, improve the lives of patients. He's a passionate advocate, as you'll hear, for research and for the biotech community. He has spent his career in the public and private sectors. Before taking the helm at MassBio, he served as Undersecretary of Economic Development in Governor Patrick's administration, and before that he was a state representative to the 11th Norfolk District for 3 terms when he focused largely on healthcare and economic development. So Bob, it's great to have you with us. After Bob, we're going to hear from Alice Moore, who's Undersecretary of Health in the Executive Office of Health and Human Services here in Massachusetts. In her position, she's responsible for creating, implementing, and managing policy, legislation, and operations for this secretariat, which is the largest in the state government. She previously was Chief of Staff to the Senate President, Therese Murray, acting as Chief Policy Advisor and Strategist and Counsel to the Massachusetts Senate. And in that role, she was deeply involved in the landmark health reform legislation here in the state that I mentioned earlier. So Alice, welcome to you as well. After Alice speaks, we'll hear from Dr. Michael Sherman. He's the Senior Vice President and Chief Medical Officer at Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, which is a not-for-profit health plan here in the state that provides a variety of insurance options to more than 1.25 million members in the state, as well as in New Hampshire and Maine and Connecticut. Michael is responsible for Harvard Pilgrim's medical trend management, engagement with providers, medical informatics, and very importantly, he's taken the lead on the value-based contracting or risk-based contracting that Harvard Pilgrim is engaging in now with a number of biopharmaceutical companies, and we'll hear more about that shortly. So, Michael, welcome. And then last but hardly least, we'll hear from Martin Zagari, MD. Martin is Vice President of Global Health Economics at Amgen, where he directs the planning, execution, and dissemination of economic and value evidence for the entire product portfolio at Amgen, going all the way from the earliest stages of molecules under investigation all the way through to marketed products. Before he joined Amgen in 2005, he held various positions at Johnson & Johnson in health economics, medical affairs, and strategic marketing. And Amgen has been on the other side of a lot of the contracts that have been struck in the value-based or outcome-based arena. So Martin, thank you very much for being with us. Each of the panelists is going to speak for about 5 minutes. Then we'll have some robust discussion among all of us, and we'll open it up to all of you for your questions and comments. So Bob, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan, and welcome everybody. To you folks that aren't from Massachusetts, welcome to Boston. And part of my job at MassBio is to recruit companies to come here. I'm not doing that today, but I want to let you all know that the weather is like this year-round. No, I guess you know that. But seriously, thank you and welcome. And Susan, thank you for the very gracious introduction. At MassBio, we're a trade association that represents over 1,000 biotech, pharmaceutical companies, hospitals, universities, venture capital firms, all the folks that make up all the ingredients of this wonderful recipe that we have here in the life sciences. And I just wanted to throw out some more statistics just to try to set the stage here and then give you real briefly my thoughts on how this happened, okay? Because it didn't happen by mistake. A lot of work went into creating this culture of innovation here. And just to set the stage, we've experienced 37% growth in employment in the biotech space in the last decade. And there was a downturn in the economy during that time. We've got more R&D biotech employment than any other state. And I love to say to my friends in California, you guys are 6 times bigger than us. We still have more R&D going on here in Massachusetts. Biomanufacturing's grown by 34%. So it's not just all science jobs. It's not all R&D jobs. There's also great manufacturing jobs that are being created. 18 out of 20 of the top pharma companies now have a significant physical presence in Massachusetts. 10 years ago, there was only a couple of them. Over 9 million square feet of lab space has been added in the last 10 years, about 4 million of that since 2013, and it's all spoken for. Top NIH funding per capita in the country, and 4 and 5 out of the top 6 NIH-funded hospitals are here in Massachusetts. But why do we all do it? Susan did mention that I used to serve in the legislature and I was involved in government. I got a first row seat to as how government could partner with industry to try to be more successful in drug discovery. And I learned that. I have a 15-year-old son that has cystic fibrosis. I didn't choose to learn about this industry. It was forced into our family situation because we had a kid that was dying. So as an elected official, not being a scientist, not being a doctor, I found that there were things that we could do from a policy standpoint to try to accelerate drug discovery and do it cheaper, better, faster so that my own kid wouldn't die. And that goes for anyone who's experiencing unmet medical needs. And when you think about the fact that 506 drugs have been developed by Massachusetts headquartered companies, I try to put that in perspective and think the fact that 250 million people in the US are living a better life today because of drugs that were discovered here. 1.8 billion patients around the world are living a better life today or alive today because of these therapies. So I think when we all get together and sit on panels like this, we try to think of that common denominator. it's a sick person. It's someone like my son. It's someone like your brother or your aunt or your uncle or your mom or dad. You know, illness doesn't pick and choose where it goes. It hits all of us, and it certainly doesn't discriminate. So it's so important that we think of that. And when you think of how Massachusetts was able to really head down this direction in the last decade, we've had strong colleges and universities. We had a bustling, a growing biotech industry. But the third thing that really made it work was a true partnership with government. The members of the legislature here, the members of the administration, the folks that serve in government here in Massachusetts, we really look towards them as partners to solve these difficult problems, one of which is going to be a topic for today. We're working on cures for drugs right now. We're working on precision medicine, breakthrough therapies, things that could change the course of disease or eradicate it. It isn't cheap. It isn't cheap. And we have to make sure that we have a payer system, and we work with the Harvard Pilgrims in the world, the public payers and the private payers, to develop a new system, a system that will enable patients to access these new therapies. I don't think there's anyone in this room or in the world for that matter that wants us to not develop cures for disease. But we all realize we have to be able to absorb the upfront costs. And that's why I'm excited to be here today. I'm always excited to sit on panels with the folks that we're here with today, because we're having the difficult discussion, and we're trying to develop solutions so that these therapies will be available for sick people. So those are my opening remarks, and it's great to be here with you guys, and thank you for attending.
Thank you, Bob, and it's a pleasure for me to sit here today. 10 years ago, I was in the Senate, and at a time where, with Dave Seltz, who's out here in the audience, and others, we were able to work through the Life Sciences Center legislation, so it's really kind of cool to be here 10 years later and be able to review back and see what successes came from the Life Sciences Center and what learnings also come from the Life Sciences Center and the experience that we've had there. Public-private partnerships are ingrained in the Massachusetts political environment and makes it essential. I think, as Governor Weld may have pointed out at the very beginning of this conference, you never know who's going to be your next greatest stakeholder and partner in negotiating something really important. And we all take that very seriously. As Undersecretary of Health, with Mary Lou Sutters as Secretary and with Governor Baker, it's been essential from day one to review what programs and services are working in health and human services and adapt others that might need to change, might need to be eliminated. And that's been a real opportunity, as EOHHS is a purchaser and as EOHHS serves 1 in 4 constituents in the Commonwealth. So moving from the Life Sciences Center to the Digital Health Council, understanding that at different times there's state funding available and at other times there's not state funding available. There have been different approaches to how we can create the environment here in Massachusetts for creativity, for innovation, for research, for breakthrough inventions, and use our role as purchaser, use our role as policymakers to support that environment. So Mass Health, which is our Massachusetts Medicaid agency and CHIP program, is engaged over the last 2 years in a very extensive stakeholder process to negotiate an 1115 waiver with CMS, and we're able to do that last year, fundamentally changing the way that Medicaid care delivery and payments are made by creating and incentivizing the advent of ACOs. And so as ACOs are being defined as different levels of healthcare providers and insurers are coming together, we are actually right now in the process of defining the contracting provisions for such care delivery and system payment reform. Very exciting time, lots in the mix, as we know. So many of us we were joking before this, we see each other in a variety of different ways. sometimes on a daily basis, whether we're talking about healthcare quality and developing important quality standards as both to assist Mass Health as they're developing and assessing value-based contracts. We need to be able to figure out how we are sharing the risk and how we are sharing the savings. And in the Massachusetts ACO program, it is new that there will be shared savings and there will be shared risk. And so we are in the process of really defining that now. The Medicaid program has a variety of tools available, some of which are constrained by federal requirements, but Massachusetts did just negotiate a great contract for purchase of Hep C. Now, with that negotiation, some leverage came to the state with the advent of a new product. And oftentimes, if many of these life-saving therapies are the only life-saving therapies, it requires all the more the public-private partnership for folks to come to the table, for those who are creating these therapies, to really understand how it is that we can make accessible these therapies, make affordable these therapies, and balance the business requirements as well. We have the Medicaid, participate in the Medicaid best price rule, negotiating supplemental rebates, and we are right now out with, for public comment with 1115 demonstration amendment that would allow the Massachusetts Medicaid program to implement a closed formulary. At this point, one of the challenges is everything's procured publicly. This would allow Medicaid more flexibility, very similar to tools that are available to the commercial insurers to be able to purchase drugs at a reduced rate. Coverage of new drugs, looking for some flexibility to assess clinical efficacy, which would guarantee our clients access through clinically proven efficacious drugs. At the same time, maintaining access to drugs and not limiting access for life-saving drugs for the folks that we serve through the Mass Health program. At EOHS, we view our role broadly, and I could go on and won't, about creating connections. And I guess I would just highlight that although healthcare costs in Massachusetts are high, they are not growing at the pace that they had been growing, and we believe that that's really critical. The other piece of this is through the connections that we are making, and we are making connections every day. One of my jobs is to make sure that we are talking to the Life Sciences Center, that we are connecting with the Mass eHealth Institute and the Mass Technology Collaborative, that we're leading on the Governor's Digital Health Council and creating that economic environment for digital startups, but not just digital startups, for scale and for people to be in Massachusetts and stay in Massachusetts. So all of those things are very exciting and I think are very important to connecting research and academics, innovation, public health initiatives, programs and services, and fundamentally also sharing information, data information that we have at EOHHS through public health reporting and others. So we look forward to the dialogue here today, and thank you all, and I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here with all of you and with the people on the podium. I think the fact that we're sitting down, both in meetings like this and in many other venues, talking about how we can work together to solve the affordability crisis versus pointing fingers, I think says a lot about how far we've come. And that to me is part of the excitement and the value that we all bring and why I get up in the morning. As Chief Medical Officer of a health plan, I worry about balancing access and affordability, just like every state does for that matter. We want our stakeholders, our members, to have access to the drugs that they need. And I'll share that when we do get appeals or looking at policies, first thing I remind my pharmacists when they're scratching their head trying to figure out what to do is to remind them, what would you do if it were a member of your family who had the disease. What's the right thing to do? Let's start with that and then figure out how to deal with the payment and the other issues. And that's a pretty good moral compass that we deal with and work by. Now, the fact is we spend about $3 billion a year on healthcare, and we're a not-for-profit, but would like to break even. We haven't been successful in the last couple of years, but we're trying. And the reason I mention that is it means that when we see new expensive drugs hit the market, and let's assume that they're good drugs that we want to make available, we're all paying for them. If you think about it, the ability to take the cost share for these expensive drugs and pass it on to an individual is very limited, or they won't fill a prescription, which means by and large, these are feeding into premiums. Over the past 5 years, actually, the cost share, the percentage paid by the individual, has gone from 34 cents of what is spent on drugs to 21.5 cents. And that represents, I would argue, the fact that costs are going up and that we're trying to protect the individual so that they do get the drugs they need. A couple of other numbers. We now spend about 1 out of every $4 on drugs. And for the specialty pharmacy portion of that, which is the fastest growing in the high cost and complex biologics, et cetera, that grew at 20% year over year. And I monitor this on a monthly basis, so those are very current numbers. And I'd argue now that some people might find that contentious. I don't think my colleagues here would do it, because I'd also say that those are numbers. Those aren't good or bad, they're numbers. And it may be that as we see some of the great blockbuster drugs coming out, that the right number is 30% or more. Particularly if we see that we're getting value from the drugs, that people are living longer, are living high quality lives, being kept out of the hospital, et cetera. So it's really not about the numbers themselves, it's about what's underlying them. Now, I'll share that we do worry about affordability. As I mentioned, when we see costs go up by that amount, it's feeding into premiums. People do want the drugs they need. They don't actually get very excited about higher premiums, so we need to work together to balance the two. And there are many approaches. My own management belief is that when we're saying no as a health plan, you're in a bad position. It's really about aligning incentives and not being seen as a bad guy, but getting everyone on the same page, all of the stakeholders. And we've been very successful in Massachusetts and some of the surrounding markets in moving away from paying fee-for-service to paying for outcomes. First and foremost, paying for quality. And it's only in the last few years that we've been able to get the pharmaceutical companies, life sciences industry on board with the same model. And that's very exciting, and I think is an opportunity for them not only to align with the rest of the system, but actually to align with the providers, the physicians and others who are writing prescriptions, whom they spend a lot of time, energy, and money trying to market to. And one great way to do that is to show that they're actually aligned with how the providers are being compensated more and more. So it is certainly the right thing to do, but it's also hard. Briefly, Harvard Pilgrim has been a leader, I think partially just because of sheer will, wanting to and believing it's the right thing to do, in part because we're a mid-sized organization, do our own rebates, et cetera, and have the ability to really to be nimble and to connect that to our pharmacy, formulary design, et cetera. So we do have a dozen agreements. Many of them are relatively modest in terms of the degree at risk, but they're showing that we can do this, and I think part of this is proof of concept. I'd also point to our agreement with Amgen for a path as being a terrific opportunity for both of us and for doing the right thing. In that agreement, we do cover their drug, their PCSK9, which is a higher cost alternative to statins that can help prevent cardiovascular events in people who have risk factors and high cholesterol, et cetera. We first expect them to try lower cost statins, as you might imagine, but following the evidence and guidelines, we do cover the drug. And for their part, if an individual covered by Harvard Pilgrim has a cardiovascular event, certain types of stroke or heart attacks, there's a full refund of all the costs paid for that drug, which I think is a terrific way to align incentives and to make it a heads you win, tails you don't lose for the payer and for the individual. Now, as we move forward, there's many, many high-cost therapies on the market. And generally, I'm excited about them, and they're the type of therapies I want for a member of my family if they have that type of condition. Whether they're gene therapies that are brand new, the CAR T therapies for cancer that are expected to the market, and both of those within the next year, they're important advances, but they're also likely to be very expensive. And So if we're trying to figure out how do we actually balance access and affordability, it's going to be important to come up with the right framework. How do we tie the cost of those drugs when they're successful to some metric? And there are organizations like ICER, the Institute for Clinical Economic Review, that are doing different models. And many of the pharma companies, and I'd applaud them for this, are taking their drugs to ICER proactively and saying, tell us what you think a fair market value price is based upon your modeling and your assumptions. And then pricing it in that way and coming up with agreements that state that you'll get that amount if the drug is successful, and quite a bit less if it's not, enough to cover manufacturing costs, et cetera. And so working together as we see these new types of drugs come out is going to be important. And I think it's going to be critical if we're going to work together to maintain affordability and prevent the need for additional regulatory type of approaches, which otherwise might be necessary.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. So we're just a few minutes away from the robust discussion, so I'll try and keep my comments short, because I am actually going to echo some of the things other panelists have said, but perhaps add a couple of observations. So, one observation, potentially for discussion, and I think we've heard it in the panelists, is that there's always a tension between kind of present day consumption, and when I say consumption, I mean kind of the things we think about in healthcare that are keeping the lights on, colonoscopies, dispensing, generic medicines, delivering babies, right, manning ERs, staffing hospitals, all the things that actually haven't changed that much since I was a physician. It's funny for me to think back. I trained at Stanford, and many of the things that are being done now are being done almost exactly the same way as they were 30 years ago. So I call that, sort of the present. But there's always a tension with the future, with future investment, with the promise of technology that perhaps hasn't delivered this day, but has huge promise for the future. And we've heard some of that today, right? Boston's obviously a center, a very future-focused center for biotechnology. And I'm privileged to work for a company that is both present in Boston and has also grown over the years. When I joined Amgen in 2005, we had about 6 products. Now we've got about 20. So hopefully we're in that tally of 500 plus products that have been added. I think that when new technology is introduced, it always looks a bit more expensive than the present day consumption. I remember, again, when going back to Stanford, I'm dating myself now, so I was training in the 80s. And one of the few diseases in the oncology area that we can actually cure at that time was Hodgkin's disease, right? That was the miracle, right, of the 80s, right? And essentially some incredibly dedicated and sort of forward-thinking oncologists figured out how to use 4 different drugs, 4 drugs, right, together. That was the CHOP regimen, right, to take the cure rate from Hodgkin's disease from about 10% to, I think it was 80 to 90% in the more favorable variants. And I remember sitting in my lecture hall just thinking how amazing that was. But even then, it was very expensive, right? These were largely still patent-protected medicines, and you had to use essentially 4 of them together, right, to cure disease, right? And so I think these are not new problems, this tension between consumption and investment. I think what does distinguish today from, say, 30 years ago is, and I think, Michael, you alluded to this, just the amazing progress we've made. The basis for a lot of the medicines we see now is the genetic revolution. So again, going back to my Stanford days, hate to over-leverage those experiences, but back then you could win a Nobel Prize for sequencing 1 gene. I don't know if you remember that, but that was the big thing, right, in the 80s was, wow, we actually can sequence a gene and make that gene work for us to make a single protein, right? And that was amazing science. So when you fast forwarded from the 80s to 2000, we sequenced the entire human genome, right? That was 15 years, and we were not just sequencing individual genes. You're doing entire genomes. As a matter of fact, I think high school students in the 2000s could buy a kit where they can now sequence genes. And so fast forward to today, you can sequence any one of our genomes in its entirety, customized for you or you, right? That takes about a day and costs less than $1,000, right? So I think biotechnology is a place where actually Moore's law, so Moore's law is a technology law that basically computing power doubles, I think every, 18 months. That's actually at play in biotechnology because these products that used to be expensive are now generic. but the future has not, played out yet as it's introduced. And as Alice has alluded to, right, there are thousands of compounds now in development. So I think, one of the challenges for discussion, and I think this is where value-based partnerships are important, is balancing this tension between present-day consumption, because that's important, right? Delivering your children, managing your high blood pressure, doing your colonoscopies, that's important. But I think these other things are important too, because ultimately it's things like Alzheimer's disease, which currently now have no effective treatment, that's projected to cost, I think, nearly $1 trillion by 2050. We need drugs to treat that, and that is a notoriously difficult area to treat, and we need to continue to invest. Heart disease kills hundreds of thousands of people a year. We're making progress with drugs like Michael mentioned, Repatha, one of ours at Amgen. But we need progress in that area, because that disease is costing us $600 billion a year in kind of present-day dollars. So the value to me of the value-based partnership is, to the point, getting people together. We need to talk about value. We have to get value right before we can get prices right. And there's a lot of kind of, let's say, frameworks for value out there that I don't think are getting value right. I think it allows us to focus on the methods to collect the data we need to actually inform the value decision. I think most importantly, though, for these value-based partnerships, it does something that we haven't done in the past, because before we were focused on contracts and prices and dollars and cents. Value-based contracts now gets us focused on outcomes, right? So value-based contracts and value-based partnerships let you focus on the things that matter most to patients, and I think that's the spirit of sort of unearthing these mutual goals that we share and putting in interactions and partnerships that can allow us to make progress at the level of where care is provided, like where Michael was talking about just a few minutes ago. So I will now turn it back over to Susan, and thank you all, and again, look forward to a great discussion.
Great. Well, thank you to all of you, and let's just reflect for a moment on what we heard. First of all, as you heard again, underscoring the dramatic growth in the biotechnology life sciences sector here in Massachusetts. Bob started us off pointing out, in addition to some of the statistics I mentioned, a 37% growth in employment in that sector, Bob, as you said, within a decade. And not just in the science side, but also in manufacturing, 34% increase in biomanufacturing over the decade alone. So again, really dramatic growth in that sector. And Alice also mentioned, as I did earlier, the hope now that the similar process can happen in the digital health sector, with the state investments and others being brought to bear in that area as well. Several of our panelists underscored the importance of public and private partnerships in creating the environment that has been conducive to this major investment in biotechnology and life sciences, as well as increasingly in digital health. They have noted that costs in the state have moderated over what was the case a decade ago. Nonetheless, again, they're still rising faster than the desired state benchmark. And in particular, we're seeing growth, as Michael mentioned, in spending on biopharmaceuticals, and especially in the so-called specialty area of drugs, these new, very innovative new therapies that we've also been discussing. And as Michael said, that now amounting to 20% rate of growth in specialty pharma a year. As was noted by Alice and others, the state has been very innovative in finding new mechanisms to pay healthcare providers, a very important innovation playing out here between Massachusetts Blue Cross Blue Shield and payers known as the Alternative Quality Contract, one of the major initial efforts in the private commercial ACO space. That's been complemented, as you heard from Alice now, through this 1115 waiver signed with CMS, which will create, under the aegis of Mass Health, the combined Medicaid and CHIP program here in the state, new ACOs in the Medicaid space, with the hope that, again, more alignment can take place between the dollars expended on health care and the value obtained for it. And as you heard Alice say, these are going to entail shared risk and shared gains, with the state as party to that shared risk and shared gains for the first time ever. So a real major innovation in the Medicaid space. And then we heard about the innovations underway around paying for these high-cost biopharmaceuticals in particular in the form of these value-based contracts. And you heard Michael describe the contract that Harvard Pilgrim has with Amgen now around this so-called PCSK9 inhibitor drug designed to treat very high cholesterol levels due to a genetic form of high cholesterol disease. The question now is, as Martin teed up for us, as we bring on more expensive medications, which surely will go through the life cycle of all drugs in this country, eventually they too will become generic and lower cost. In the meantime, there's this issue about how do we balance the tension between these extremely high-cost medications, the fact that we need dollars today to spend on many other needs, as well as on health care. How do we balance that tension? So thank you, all of you, for teeing up these very important issues for discussion. So let's go back, if we could, for a moment to the value-based contracting, Michael. And I want to ask you more about this because, as you know, there is skepticism around about whether value-based contracting is going to be a real path to resolving these tensions between high-cost drugs and our current needs. And Harvard Pilgrim really has been a leader. Candidly, not all the Massachusetts insurers are on the same page around this strategy. Tell us how you see this playing out, and is it a model for states, commercial sector entities, and others moving forward to really structure the kinds of arrangements that will make these high-cost drugs, if not necessarily affordable, at least manageable, and position us to reap the long-term benefits that Martin identified?
Yeah. A great question, and that is what we spend a lot of our time thinking about. And I'd remind everyone that we spend quite a bit of time out there trying to sell this concept to pharma companies. Our oldest agreement of our dozen is only about 2 years old. So we really are in the early innings and just starting to collect data. A couple of other points about the current state. One, there are fairly moderate amounts at risk, with the exception of Amgen, where they're 100% at risk when there is an adverse outcome. And in general, in fact, for all of these cases, they're for drugs where there's competition. To date, we have not been effective in driving toward agreements where there is no competition. And when you talk about drugs where there's no competition, generally, no surprise, those are where the costs are highest. And so where I think about where we need to go from here in order to be successful, and I agree the jury is out, we need to show what we can do together, and I think that many stakeholders have reasons for wanting to work. And again, I'm encouraged even by some of the pharma companies and biotechs that are coming to us very early, where their drug may be a year away from approval, and they are high-cost specialty drugs, and they're starting to talk to us about what kind of endpoints do you think are amenable for these type of agreements. If we put the patient on a drug and we fail to avoid a liver transplant, if we take risk for that and that leads to refund of payment, would that be of interest? So there's a lot of dialogue underway. There's more life sciences companies going proactively to organizations like ICER, which, as I mentioned, is one of a number of entities that has value frameworks and essentially comes up with what you might think of as a fair market value. And I'll add that when they're priced similar to what ICER comes up with, there's a grand bargain emerging where payers tend to say, yes, we want to promote use of that drug. So it's, again, a win-win. And we see, for example, Sanofi Regeneron took their atopic dermatitis drug to ICER, said it should be in the $30,000 range. It was priced pretty close to that, and the payers are looking to that and saying, gee, that's fair value. We should encourage that drug. And we see some of the CAR T companies and gene therapy companies that have gone to ICER and said, essentially, we want you to evaluate our drug. Not we're afraid you'll evaluate it. We want you to. And because they're anticipating the need for value-based agreements and knowing that a value-based agreement in itself is not sufficient, you need some sort of benchmark to tell you that with that agreement, you're at a price that's reasonable and fair for all stakeholders. And I do mean for all stakeholders. Again, we have a vibrant life sciences industry in the state and elsewhere. And understanding that R&D is risky, there should be a fair rate of return to investors and other stakeholders to incentivize allocation of capital to that end. So we really need to think about what works for all parties. Where I see us heading, and where I hope we're heading, though, is toward more agreements for some of these high-cost drugs, whether for some of these rare diseases, for oncology, for gene therapy, where assuming that the value frameworks may show that a high cost is reasonable, we still need to figure out how do we afford that, in part through paying maybe 90% less in those cases where it doesn't work, enough to cover the cost of manufacture and other costs, but not to provide that kind of profit. That will allow us to pay those large amounts where it is successful. We're having discussions about how do we pay for some of these over multiple years, again, to help bridge affordability so that the budget impact doesn't become a reason not to cover drugs when it's the right thing to do. I'd also point out two other opportunities here. One is we frequently talk about real-world evidence, and what that acknowledges is that when you do clinical trials in very controlled settings with the best providers, the best physicians and researchers, with every patient followed by a clinical research associate and other things that are in place, and you then put that out in the real world where docs are busy and trying to see patients every 15 minutes and may not be the world's expert in that, sometimes your mileage varies. And so some health plans are for good reason skeptical of the initial data that comes out. And again, agreeing essentially to warrant the data that you use to get the drug approved seems both fair and is a way to bridge that divide. And then finally, the other opportunity here is that we're seeing more and more drugs approved with what historically would have been viewed as limited data. If you think about Exondys or some of the Spinraza, Radicava, these are very expensive drugs that were approved with very, very limited evidence. Now, the fact is, just to be fair, for some of these conditions and for others that may be ultra rare, it may be hard, if not impossible, to do what would be considered a well-controlled clinical trial because there's not enough patients out there. So the question becomes, how do you provide access to these drugs for these patients in the absence of really good data at a high cost without being overly limiting and spending money that really is being wasted? And I think that's another perfect example for us to have agreements where if the FDA wants to accelerate the approval of some of these drugs in the interest of making them available, then let's agree to do that. But if it's not effective, just please don't send us a bill. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity, and I think there's a lot of reason for all of the stakeholders at the table to want to make this work and to think about how do we take it to the next level.
Bob, I'll come to you for a comment in a moment, but Martin, I want to go to you first and ask you how this is all going to work out for biopharmaceutical companies. In the case of the PCSK9 inhibitors, ironically, there was a lot of belief that these were going to be blockbuster, very expensive drugs. It looks like and they are expensive, but the volume of sales has turned out to be much less than was predicted. And it might be that these value-based contracts played a role in that by containing the group of patients on whom these drugs were used. So I guess the question is, in the long run, is this form of contracting going to work out for the life sciences sector?
So I would separate two issues. One, maybe relating specifically to therapies and their uptake rates, and second, our value-based partnerships, a tool for getting the right patient, the right medicine at the right time, which is, I think we can agree, what we all want, right? We develop this therapeutic armamentarium for patients. They're usually patients these days, because of the genetic revolution, that are sometimes highly specialized, hard to find. Michael, you already alluded to it. Sometimes it's even difficult to do a trial for some of these patients in a regular sense, and will value-based partnerships help that? So on the first issue, in terms of uptake, I think that we are thinking carefully in a constrained environment about who gets which drug. I think sometimes, though, there is some overshoot, and I think in the case of PCSK9s, there are still folks out there, well-meaning folks, I think, but still folks out there writing opinion pieces and sending letters in under the mistaken impression that this is a class of drugs that potentially costs $200 or $300 billion, right? Because in my mind, they're doing math that doesn't do us any service as a healthcare system in planning for a real scenario with real patients in real settings of care. They're essentially taking the label, assuming 100% use plus some spillover, right? And that's not the way drugs get used, right? They get used a lot more thoughtfully than that. They get taken up and they get applied. Physicians have to get experience with them. And so I think what we're actually seeing is a measured uptake, which is what we want, right? I mean, we want measured, thoughtful uptake of products, but I think there's actually been some overshoot because of the bad math that was basically circulated. And I don't think anyone, it's no surprise, 3-4 years ago, right, there were some major cost struggles with affording Sovaldi, right? And Sovaldi, I think, was
The first of the hepatitis C drugs.
Of the hepatitis C drugs. And I think Sovaldi was different for a whole lot of reasons, not the least of which there were, hundreds of thousands of patients who were essentially warehoused waiting for these drugs, right? And, these were the promise for them. And there was a huge spike in the year they were introduced, which incidentally has actually come down quite a bit. And that created a huge affordability problem at that year in time. And I think that sort of phenomenon, which is actually difficult to extrapolate to most other drugs, has actually now created a much tighter and I would say overshot environment for the adoption of new technology. So we're trying to work through, with a lot of the payers, how do we come back a little bit and get the right medicine to the right patient at the right time, and I would also argue at the right price, right? And that's the bridge to value, right? It's right patient, right time, right price is the value bridge. So will they work out for us? I think Michael said something very important. These things are barely a couple years old. I think the worst thing that's going to happen, or that could happen, is that we oversell how quickly they change human behavior, and we undersell how hard they may be to do. So let me talk first about overselling. It's easy to oversell how quick it is to change human behavior, because let's face it, the fastest, easiest, and surest thing to do in terms of drug contracting is the old way, right? Where we just haggle over discounts, right? We haggle, we get to a number, and then everyone knows what that number is, right? That's easy, and people are used to it. It's not easy, but it's basically, it creates a lot less uncertainty. You alluded to value-based contracts create more uncertainty, right? We have to actually put something on the line. Both the payer as well as the pharma company are actually entering into an area that is more risky for both sides, right? Because we actually, neither side has the data to be able to play out into the future exactly how these contracts may pay off for one side or the other. But I think that's actually a good sign, the fact that each side is willing to come to the table, put something at risk. But I think that, again, the most important thing is that when you come together and haggle over a price, that doesn't require you to do anything that gets you to the level of the patient. It doesn't require you to measure outcomes. It doesn't keep anyone accountable for drugs actually working. So to me, the most important thing about the value-based partnerships is we're going to have to give them time. We're going to have to devote some resource into them to measure outcomes, to collect data. And I think we're also going to have to be willing to be a bit more transparent. I actually believe that biotechnology is creating so much value that in the end, that transparency, that measurement, and that agreement on value is only going to help our industry, over time. And so I'm excited at the infancy of these things, because I think that when the more people know about what our medicines do and how they can basically change healthcare, the more people I think will be willing to again, pay forward and innovate for the future.
Let me just add that, and again, I would agree with everything that Martin said. I'd add that I actually think these agreements will facilitate market access. If you think about the things that people in my position worry about, it's spending money on something that doesn't work. If you remove that as a barrier, so that a new drug comes to market, it's expensive. We can always say, gee, we're not sure how long that CAR T therapy will be effective for, the gene therapy, and it's really expensive. Let's wait a year or two, or let's limit it to this subsegment where the data is really good, which may be good from a cost perspective, but kind of bad if you're one of the people who would benefit from that drug. And if that allows us, it creates an environment where we can say, fine, we're not going to restrict it for that group. In return, you agree not to charge us if it doesn't have the effect. That's going to expand access, and again, do so in a way that doesn't lead to wasted dollars that could be spent on other things.
Bob.
I just want to add to that from an industry standpoint. These two companies should truly be commended because they're trying to do something new. They're trying to solve the problem. It's a market-based solution. And what we try to talk to our elected officials and leadership here in Massachusetts is give us some time to try to work this out. We know there's a problem. My advice to other state legislators would be to, encourage this type of dialogue. What we've done as an industry, working with the health plan industry in Massachusetts, has brought the Michael Shermans from the various payers and the Martin Cigaris from various companies. And we're actually having summits through NEHI. NEHI is the moderator, the convener, and we're trying to outline all the things that need to happen so that they can be better at this. There's certain state and federal regulatory limitations to what you can do here. So as government, there's things we can do to get out of the way to encourage this and make it happen, and that's what government should be doing. Because like you said, and think about what's happened around hepatitis C. With the increase of competition, the pricing's coming way down. That's a huge value drug. And I couldn't agree more, Martin, that we're in the business of inventing new therapies that change the course of disease. That keeps people healthy, it keeps them working, it keeps them out of the hospital. It does everything to save money, and we've never had a system that accounts for savings. So there has to be some sort of encouragement or incentive, and how can government encourage our industries to continue to do what's happening here?
So in a moment, we're going to go to questions from all of you, and mics will be available. So when you do have a question, if you would raise your hand, we'll get a mic over to you. Before we go to the mic, though, I want to bring one question back to Alice, which is just on the point that Bob made and that Martin made earlier. A great hope is that investments in biotechnology will result in the kinds of therapies that will produce these important breakthroughs and cures and displace a lot of other healthcare expenditures that we're making now. But there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. As often is observed, a dollar of somebody's healthcare expense is a dollar of somebody else's healthcare income. We can imagine entities in the system that will fight long and hard to keep from giving up that dollar of income. How, from a state perspective, and what would you share with other states about managing, if we can manage this process of displacing elements of healthcare, which are very expensive currently, and replacing them with other innovations?
Well, we're going to need to adapt as things change, as new therapies are introduced. And I would distinguish between those curative therapies, those therapies that cure the ailment versus those therapies that treat the ailment. And I think that's where the value-based approach gets to be a challenge. But in the ACO model that we're designing through the Medicaid program, there's shared savings and shared risk, but with the, applied to the total care of the patient, of the client. So it's getting at Martin's point about right care, right time, right treatment, right place. You can't just look at one piece of it and look at the pharma piece of it. From our perspective, we really need to be looking at all of it and developing quality and value measurements and requiring performance and assessing outcomes to be able to be in a position to change and assess what's working and what's not. And so I don't think healthcare will be ever static from here. I think we've got too much innovation, which is a fabulous thing. And to the extent that that reduces need for acute care beds, for example, I mean, one of the things that the goals that we have is treating people in the community and reinvigorating or directing people back to the community, especially in the behavioral health arena. So adapting to the changes and bringing all of the stakeholders in line, I don't think it's ever going to be a situation where hospitals aren't necessary, for sure, but how hospitals are used may change, and how the space within those hospitals are used may change, and adapt to research and academics, and as they always have here in Massachusetts, and as they continue to come to the table and have the discussion with us. So the 1115 waiver has really been an opportunity to talk about transforming healthcare and also making sure that we're measuring it and holding ourselves accountable.
Great. All right. We are officially open for questions or comments or short speeches masquerading as questions from the audience. So if you do have a question, raise your hand and we will get a mic over to you. And of course, I'm sure this panel would benefit from knowing what other states are doing and whether there are lessons to be learned here in Massachusetts from those other parts of the country. If you would identify yourself also by name and affiliation, that would be very helpful.
Great, good afternoon. I'm David Seltz from Massachusetts Health Policy Commission. Thank you for this great panel. One of the themes from this conference has been finding bipartisan solutions. And one of the issues that I've seen in polling that has overwhelmingly bipartisan support is increasing the transparency of pharmaceutical pricing and spending trends. And so my question really is for Bob. Is the industry willing to step up and partner with states in increasing transparency in this industry, just as hospitals and health plans already have done that?
The answer is absolutely, David. However, and I've said this before on other panels, what is transparency? We've got transparency legislation in Massachusetts that is horrible. It doesn't do anything to lower the cost of inventing a drug. It doesn't do anything to help a patient. It doesn't do anything to change how we do business. If we're going to have transparency legislation, I couldn't agree with Martin more. Let's have transparency out there from the beginning to when a patient takes drugs. So let's look at really how much money does a company put towards R&D. That's easy to come up with. The transparency legislation that sticks along with the minute something becomes NIH funding to becoming something that's patented, to a BD deal with an investment from a VC, then a partnership with a large pharma company. That's just silly trying to figure all that out, all right? Let's figure out what transparency really means. Let's talk about transparency as it relates to the payers and formularies and whatnot. Let's talk about transparency with PBMs and where does that fit in? My goodness. So yes, of course, we should have sorts of transparency, but if it's going to be a consumer-focused bill or piece of legislation, let's do it the right way. Right, David?
Michael, I know you have some different thoughts on this topic.
Well, again, won't claim to be an expert on all of the bills that are out there, but I mean, the reason we're having this dialogue is people are questioning the value of the medications and the pricing. So, I don't know whether a transparency bill is the best way to get there. I hope if there's something for the sake of the life sciences companies, that if they were to do something, it's at least standardized across the 50 states. Yeah, my sympathy on that. But again, the issue is there are a lot of questions out there. And for example, insurers are required to share the MLR, the medical loss ratio, in other words, the percentage of the dollar that's spent on care or around that versus marketing and profit and executive salaries. So I could see something analogous. Again, I'm not smart enough to know how do you actually define it. I could see something analogous that would provide some comfort to, to the population, to all the stakeholders. And again, I think it's also fair to say there's a large discrepancy among pharma companies. Frankly, a lot of the ones I deal with and the brand names you think of, I think, are spending a lot on R&D. There's also some bad actors out there, which I think my colleagues would agree on. So I could see something like that. Quite frankly, if I had my wish, there'd be a opportunity to price in a way that aligns with an entity like ICER. And if you show again, that's another way to answer the question. And again, we can debate whether that's the right framework and whether it needs to be adjusted, but conceptually with an independent framework that says, this is fair market value in a way that we as society think we can afford. And if you are priced that way, terrific. If not, perhaps you're subject to additional state reporting burden. So maybe there's a way to create an incentive to cooperate in that manner in a voluntary way with some other methodology.
Okay, great, thank you. So, question over here, please.
Representative Heaton from Iowa. So maybe, Michael, you answered my question, but I want to refer to Alice and ask her, as you determine the value and you come up with a decision to say it should be part of the ACO, Medicaid ACO formulary, my question is, in your work, would it also be the same score in the formulary for Medicare? And would it also be on the formularies for all the rest of the insurance companies. I'm looking at consistency across the way. Why one and not the other? That's the challenge we always face in the legislation that we have.
Yeah, agreed. We have to start somewhere. ACOs are not a new concept, and we're slow to start here. So to the extent that we are innovating in that space, I think it's important that we balance and always take into account the Medicare requirements, but sometimes Massachusetts needs to experiment, and that's what this is. But we're always guided by other standards. For example, in the quality measurements that we are reviewing now, we're very cognizant of the multiple sets of quality measurements that exist on the federal side, as well as the quality measurements that exist in the commercial insurance world, and really trying to bring constituencies along to agree on what the next set of quality measurements should be. But we exist in this healthcare world with multiple regulators. And so coexisting, I think the best thing we can do is make sure that we're informed by all of the different requirements, and that we strive for consistency, because I think that's important to the market.
Michael, how problematic will it be here if there is one set of formularies on the commercial side, as potentially would be the case with Harvard Pilgrim, and a different formulary on the Medicaid side?
It's really, really hard to align for a whole variety of reasons. So, and whether it's because we're competing and negotiating individually with pharma companies, or sometimes we read the data differently. So I'll give you an example. When the second company came out with a Hep C drug, AbbVie, they came out with the drug Viacara. Some of our competitors preferred that drug. We preferred the Gilead drugs, Sovaldi and then Harvoni. The reason for that is that the other drug required a pill burden of as many as 10 pills a day, and the Gilead drug was 1 pill a day. I can't force our competitors to agree with our assessment, which is to prefer the Gilead drug, because we thought with 1 pill a day, the chances of someone being adherent and taking the drug correctly and getting a cure was better. Again, there's no way, there's no mechanism for us to impose that on another party. They may have decided they got a slightly better price on the other one and it was worth it. So we're all interpreting things differently. I'll also add that we're actually not allowed to, I think the word would be collusion, we're not allowed to sit down and develop common policies that would violate a whole lot of laws that I know our legal staff would prefer we not do. That said, but I also, just briefly, where I think we need to figure out a solution are with things like gene therapy. So we have gene therapy, we have a number of other high-cost treatments that are likely to be relatively rare within any given health plan or maybe a state environment, where they're likely to be very expensive, and where there's likely to be uncertainty at first as to the value, and even to the extent that they will last over many years, if you think about things like hemophilia cures, et cetera. And for that reason, many of us are sitting at the table having discussions, how do we pay for these over multiple years? And without a common policy, in other words, if a patient leaving Harvard Pilgrim and going to a competitor or going from Mass Health to us, et cetera, if that ongoing payment mechanism doesn't flow with them, it's very hard to do these. Not impossible, and we're exploring it, but it's very hard. So I think there's a need here for some common policies around some of these high-cost drugs, but given the legal requirements and et cetera, it's hard to do. I know there are many organizations, NEHI and others, that are trying to pull together groups, and there may be ways we can do this in public ways that are transparent with the stakeholders at the table, but it is an opportunity, particularly for those classes.
And to make clear what kinds of dollars that we're talking about, whereas a course of hepatitis C drugs could have been at the peak 85,000 or 90,000. Give an example of what we're talking about with respect to the gene therapy drugs.
There's generally the discussions that I see are looking anywhere from $1 to $2 million. That's what most people think this will be per treatment. And again, they may be one-time and curative, but you still have the question, how do you pay for them up front, and particularly with unknowns around their durability, et cetera. So again, we don't want that cost burden to be a reason to keep them from the people who need them, which is why we need those kind understandings and common policies to enable these kind of payment mechanisms.
And I think you and some of the other payers have pointed out in Massachusetts, 1 or 2 of those drugs could mean 1 or 2% on the premium dollar for the entire state. So it's real money.
Thank
Yes.
you. Delegate Lewis Young from Maryland. And I'd like to follow up on that transparency question because Maryland successfully passed price gouging legislation that basically said that if the cost of a drug increased by a certain amount of money or a percentage, it would trigger an AG investigation. So about 2 to 3 months after the legislation passed, we were informed that there's a lawsuit from some pharmaceutical companies. So I'm just curious if any of you might want to comment, given that is legislation that was designed to protect consumer accessibility and affordability, why there might be some objections to an inquiry and an explanation as to why such a significant cost increase.
And it's my understanding that legislation was particularly directed at the bad actor phenomenon that Michael referenced, that Martin Shkreli being an example, who was just found guilty on several charges, essentially not unrelated charges, I should say, but nonetheless came in, bought a pharmaceutical company, hiked the price up dramatically, no relationship to the underlying cost of producing the drug, and obviously harmed a number of people with HIV. Anybody want to comment on that kind of legislation?
I'd just add that it really shined the spotlight on issues in the generic industry. If you look at what Martin Shkreli did, that's unconscionable, and it's because there's not enough competition in the generic space. The pharma industry is the only component of the healthcare industry that has built-in cost reductions. We have a data exclusivity period for small molecule drugs, large molecule drugs, and then the fact that they go to generic, it's supposed to be cheap to create headspace for new drugs to come into the system. So when people behave like Martin Shkreli because there was no competition, it upsets the whole apple cart. It drives me nuts. It's so upsetting. And if you look at the whole EpiPen situation and what's happened there, that has nothing to do with the companies that are actually innovating new therapies. So what is the FDA doing now? They're increasing the resources so generic manufacturers can come online quicker. The FDA is also identifying now and publishing a list of drugs that are off exclusivity, that don't have competition, and hopefully we can get more market-based solutions around competition there to solve that problem. But it's so difficult to explain to people the difference between branded pharma new drugs and the generic industry because we're just not familiar with the industry. It's confusing. But thank you.
I think we probably have time for one more brief question, if there is one. Right. Okay.
I'd like to follow up on the generic question, Kathy Kelker from Montana. What we have discovered, and I'm glad you're angry, is that there are very few companies that are interested in producing the generic drugs. And the generic drugs that are available, at least for us, where I live way out there in the mountains, tend to be priced just a little bit under the drugs that are still under patent. And is there anything that you can do in this partnership, state level stuff that would, we're a small population state. They're not going to do something special for Montana. Are there influences that we could have on, let's have those generic drugs manufactured, they're needed, and it costs so much less for our people. What can we do?
Michael, there has been an issue lately of rapid price increases in generic drug sector. How are you coping with this, and what, if anything, might be done on a value-based contracting basis?
I was actually hoping somebody else would answer the question because I don't know that I have a good answer. I was hearing Montana. Tax breaks to bring generic companies to Montana, perhaps. I know, but the issue, no, seriously, the issue is there's a number of generics that have seen unconscionable price hikes as a percentage. And the issue is, in many of these cases, the number of competitors has shrunk to 1 or 2. And the truth is, there's very little we can do. The companies are, their strategy is predicated on our need to make the drugs available to our insured members. and doctors need to prescribe them. And with a lack of competition, and frankly, again, unless there's state or other actions, again, based on these kind of egregious hikes, there's very little we can do. I guess what we won't do is put our patients in the middle. So I don't have any good answers other than spurring competition or somehow punishing those who are bad actors.
Yeah, I think actually there's with everything going on in healthcare at the federal level, you can have whatever opinion you want, but some of the signals coming out of the FDA are actually favorable. So Scott Gottlieb seems to have embraced
the
this.
new FDA
head, right, seems to have embraced this idea that, and we completely agree with this. We watch the generic space very carefully because, as I alluded to in my introductory comments, a vibrant generic space that provides society access to these medicines once their patents have expired is absolutely essential to an innovative space to continue to bring medicines to the market. So if you have a failure in the generic marketplace, even though actually the generic marketplace, just to be very clear, the generic marketplace as a whole, thousands and thousands of medicines, is actually working quite well. Those medicines on the whole continue to decrease in average price and provide more access to more patients than ever before. However, the headline grabbing stories, right, are those handful of medicines that do experience these price increases because of market failures, basically lack of competition. And I think the new FDA commissioner has basically suggested that for those areas that are basically in jeopardy of not having enough competition, of experiencing these sorts of market distortions, they will fast track applications to provide medicines in these areas. And I don't think you have to make it instantaneous. I think once you cut that interval down from 2.5 years to maybe 4 months, right, that will actually prevent the type of arbitrage activity that we saw in the most egregious cases of generic price distortion. So I think there actually is some mindfulness of that area.
Well, unfortunately, we are at the end of our time, but those of you who want to learn much more about the biotech sector in this state can join the Biotechnology Tour, and I think we have some more information available about that now.
Yes, and let's first give this great panel a round of thank you, and to Susan Dentzer, our celebrity hostess. Thank you so very much.